Okay, uncertainty in Europe. We don't know how serious the crisis is over sovereign debt. We don't know what the ECB and those ministers can or cannot do. We'll wait for the G20. But in the interim, how are markets responding? It's been a bloodbath in many international markets.
Yeah, it's been a bloodbath in many international markets as well as African markets. You know, we're seeing, it's been the trend for the last 6 months probably. You know, it started with North Africa crises, you know, but the Euro debt crisis is actually much more of a problem because obviously we've got markets like Mauritius, you know, who are closely linked to the euro. But what we're finding is a lot of outflows from emerging market funds, and that's really not helping sentiment, particularly when volumes are low. So it's tough going at the moment.
Some are saying we could. It's just a matter of time. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when there's going to be a default in Greece, and the extent to which a lot of banks are geared towards some of those financial institutions. What bearing is that going to have on Africa, do you think?
Well, I suppose what is bearing internationally, I mean, it will be horrific, won't it? Because as you say, virtually every bank will have some exposure to Greece in some way or form. You know, so it definitely will be a negative because, as we know, Africa works in a risk-averse fashion, you know. So if risk is really off, which would happen certainly if Greece defaults, then we'll see, I would assume, even worse volumes and probably worse performance than we're seeing.
Obviously, people are looking at African debt and comparing it to other emerging markets as you're talking about those outflows. How are bonds like the Nigerian bond performing? Because people have been looking at that as a barometer of investment sentiment.
Yeah, and it's, in fact, you're right. It's a lot of people have always thought that equities was the be-all and end-all. And, you know, some of these markets like Nigeria has changed the restriction on foreign holding. It used to be 1 year, now they've forgone that. So it's easier for people to now play into those alternative markets. So people are looking there for alternative yields, particularly in light of the fact that equities is very poor. You know, we see at WAPCO, Lafarge WAPCO, which is obviously a cement maker in Nigeria, they announced a corporate bond which they'll release, and that's 11 to 13% yield, which is not bad when you consider what would you get through equities when there's so much risk aversion on.
Best performing bourses, Zambia?
No, Zambia was actually flat. Sorry, that's
okay.
Yeah. But Kenya was the best performer in our...
In what way, though? I know that they've gained a little bit of ground, but I mean, it's hardly those figures we saw in 2010.
No, exactly. But I think the pleasing thing is that Kenya's not going down, which it has been very much so for the whole year, as we know. No, it was a pleasing bounce. You know, I think a lot of people have now said, well, enough's enough. The market's trading at a ridiculous low. There was a big block in Safaricom on offer, and that really held the name down. That's been cleared, and since then we found demand building up. We also saw banks dropping the interbank lending rate, and that really gave the banks a bit of a bid. We saw Equity Bank up 5 and a bit %. But the biggest gainer was Sasini.
23%.
Correct, yeah. And that's because they're using some of their land to develop property, which, as we know, property in Kenya is a very vibrant sector. And obviously for that name, it allows them to diversify revenues.
Okay, although volumes are very thin, Malawi was a bit impressive.
It was, but again, yeah, volumes very thin. And, you know, it was the usual name Press Corp, which obviously dominates trading there. That sort of found some demand. And there was some speculative trading on TNM, which also spurred the market on a little bit.
Ghana has jumped up, and it's due largely to what's going on at Tullow. I mean, should we be excited about this? Not even Ghanaians are excited. They're saying, you know, Tullow, just by purely its size, has boosted capitalization. That when Tullow moves, obviously it reflects on the bourse, but is that a fair indicator?
No, it's not a fair indicator. You're quite right. You know, it is 50% of the stock exchange now, so any movement in the name will really sway the index. But what you found is that name and Total Petroleum were the only names that were actually positive. All the blue chips actually traded in the red. So what is a true barometer? It's difficult to say. Okay,
let's look at the worst performers. Okay, the Zim Mining Index, no surprises there.
No surprises. I mean, it's the indigenization rules obviously dominating talk there. But what's very interesting, as we know, it's 4 stocks, and you can see obviously how erratic it is. You know, and if you look, you had Rio Zim and Bandura both down more than 20%, and then you had Felgold up 15%. So it shows you the disparity even within an index.
Let's continue with Zimbabwe, and the issue is we're not getting clarity. We know that indigenization is the law. The implementation is where we don't seem to be understanding anything. The empowerment minister talks about revoking mining licenses. The mining minister says no, that's not something that I'm prepared to pursue as an option. There was that mining in Daba last week. Do we have any sense of what exactly the government is planning on doing?
No, and that's the whole problem. I mean, what do investors hate more than anything is uncertainty, you know. And that's, you're quite right, because you're hearing one thing one day and then Zimplats is suspended one day, it's fine the next day. So it's very difficult for guys to call, and that is exactly what this uncertainty is about.
Mauritius, obviously you mentioned the fact that they have a lot of exposure to Europe and hence them being battered right now. if Europe persists with the crises unfolding, do you expect this to be an underperformer?
It has to be, yeah. It's just so closely linked to the euro, you know. And you're quite right. If euro continues to just underperform, I think Mauritius is going to struggle on the back of it.
And the impact of the downgrade of French banks?
Well, same thing, you know. There was obviously the Moody's downgrade, as we know. Same thing, you know. It doesn't impact positively because of the close relationship with Europe and France.
Botswana?
Yeah, Botswana, again, volumes are very thin, but there were two names there which really traded down, and that's, you know, obviously dragging the index down. There was BIHL, which was down on the back of profit taking. But the bigger story is Leshego, which, as we know, is the most active of the trading names in Botswana. There was a cautionary came out a couple of weeks ago about the fact that they cannot deduct repayments at source, which is obviously very negative because it introduces a whole new risk to the company. So we saw that name really trading down. It's struggling at the moment.
Okay, let's turn our attention to North Africa, and we have seen subdued activities in Egypt and Morocco. I find this interesting because when everything was going down with the Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt, Morocco seemed to hold its own. But now, in some way or another, it seems to track in many ways activities there.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's very difficult to call again, you know, because volumes are sometimes thin. They do typically follow, obviously, the North Africa and MENA crisis, you know, plus globally. And I think that trend is, you know, hurting both of them. As we know, Egypt and Morocco were both in the worst performing markets.